Today we're going to try to answer the question for you, does archaeology support the Gospels? And I could have done a lot more research, because every time I go looking for things, there are more instances that I didn't know about of where they've put shovel to dirt and they've found something that confirmed what the Bible said. We're only going to look at a few things today because we're not looking at the whole Bible. We're just looking at the Gospels and the things that speak to the credibility of the Gospel writers. But even then, we're not looking at all of the evidence. There are other things that I could have brought in this morning. But the question here is whether or not archaeology supports the Bible. And I believe that it does. That's what I'm doing here. But it goes to the question, does the archaeological evidence uphold the historical accuracy of the Gospels or prove them to be fictitious? We hear all the time that the Gospels are just fairy tales, don't we? We hear people more and more. We hear even, I know I mentioned it twice on Sunday, you're probably tired of hearing about it, but John Shelby Spong, the former Anglican Bishop of Newark, supposedly a Christian leader, supposedly a shepherd of God's people, claiming the Bible not to be what it says it is, claiming the book of John to have been just a morality tale or something. In other words, made up by people to prove a point, but not really historically accurate. And if it's historically accurate, there should be some archaeological evidence to back it up. If it's historically inaccurate, there should be archaeological evidence to demonstrate that as well, and that's what we're going to look at today. I saw this quote from Sir Isaac Newton. How many of you know who he is? Anybody? Do you remember the story about the apple falling off the tree, hitting him on the head? He's the one that really, I won't say discovered gravity because it's always been there, but sort of described how it worked. One of the most brilliant men that has lived, and certainly not an Orthodox Christian like we would be. If he was around today, we probably wouldn't admit him to membership in our church because of some of his doctrinal views. But even he, as one of the premier scientific minds of his time, wrote that there are more sure marks of authenticity in the Bible than in any profane history. When he says profane, he doesn't mean curse words and such, but he means any secular history. That there are more clues in the Bible to its authenticity. There's more evidence in the Bible for its authenticity than there is in the writings of Tacitus, than there are in the writings of Julius Caesar, than there are in the writings of any other historian that everybody looks at from ancient history and says, oh, these guys are credible, we don't doubt for a second what they wrote, and yet there's more internal proof and external proof for the Bible than there is for any of those. So we're going to look today, first of all, before we get into some of the examples from archaeology, we're going to look at what archaeology can and can't do. Archaeology only has limited powers when it comes to proving or disproving the Bible or any religious text. And we want to be careful because as much as I want to convince everybody that the Bible is true, that Jesus Christ is who he said he is, we've got to be careful not to go further than what the evidence warrants. Because for example, if we found a giant boat made of gopher wood on Mount Ararat, we would know what that is, right? We can't look at that and say, see, we found Noah's Ark, that means Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Well, we could make that case, but the ark itself doesn't prove that. It just proves that the story of Noah's Ark was true. And if we start leaping in our claims, if we start leaping beyond what the evidence warrants, we quickly lose credibility with people by making connections that aren't there. It's like those who would say, well, every time, and nobody really does say this, but it would be like saying this, every time the rooster crows, the sun comes up. So that proves the rooster makes the sun come. It's not a correct correlation there. So we want to be careful in how we use archaeology. Archaeology can verify historical or scientific details in the religious text. We can go and dig up things and say, okay, yes, Jesus existed. Yes, this king existed. Yes, he ruled. Yes, this empire was there. We can prove through archaeology the historical and scientific details that underscore the story of the Bible. But archaeology can't validate the spiritual claims in a religious text. We can prove from archaeology that Jesus existed. We could prove that Jerusalem was exactly as John described it. We could prove that he was crucified. We could do all of these things, and it still doesn't, just from the archaeology, prove that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. Now, we get into other things for that. I believe there is proof that he's the Son of God. But archaeology itself doesn't prove everything we want it to prove. So we've got to be careful about what we claim. And the same is true for anybody else. Archaeology can prove that there is a temple lot in Independence, Missouri. You can still see where they built some of the things and where they laid it out to prepare building a temple. Archaeology can prove that there was a temple lot set up in Independence, Missouri. That doesn't prove that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, does it? Archaeology proves that they've been worshiping at the Kaaba shrine in Mecca for centuries. That doesn't prove that Muhammad was a prophet of God. Okay, so we can prove or disprove historical and scientific claims from archaeology, but it doesn't prove the spiritual claims. So archaeology's role, as we go through all these things and look at the evidence, archaeology's role is to either enhance or undermine the credibility of the text. So we can begin building a case. If all of these details from the Bible are disproven by archaeology, that starts to make the case that the Bible's not really reliable as we would hold it to be. If, on the other hand, every time archaeologists go to look at something concerning the Bible, what they find is a confirmation of what the Bible says, that starts to build a case for the credibility of the Bible, that, if the Bible is meticulously credible in these tiny details, then maybe it's credible in the bigger things as well. Also, archaeology can verify many of the details of a story. We can look at archaeology and we can see the place existed, we could see there were people there at that time, we can see what they did, but it can't verify every detail of a story. Okay? We can prove, maybe through archaeology, that crucifixion was used in the time of Christ, and I shared that with you on a Wednesday night, that for a long time they said crucifixion wasn't commonly used by the Romans in Jesus' time until they found a skeleton of a man with the nails still driven through his feet and into the wood. Archaeology can demonstrate that crucifixion, for example, was used. It can't necessarily prove that the crowd cried out, "Crucify him." I mean, there's no archaeological way to prove that. Oh, excuse me, we skipped ahead. So it can't verify every detail of the story. And if the standard of proof is that we have to find some artifact that proves every detail in the Bible before we're willing to buy it, there's no source in history, ancient or modern, that stands up to that kind of scrutiny. So archaeology can prove a lot of details, but we can't expect it to prove every detail of every story, because there's just not. I mean, there aren't artifacts left for everything. You might find a movie stub in my pocket that proves I was at the theater, but you can't necessarily prove from that I stayed for the whole thing. So, archaeology has its limits, I guess is what I'm trying to tell you. So we move into a few of the examples of some of the archaeological claims for evidence, some of the archaeological evidence for claims of the Gospels. And some of these things you may look at and say, really, these are the things that cause people to doubt the Bible? They focused on that? Somebody took the time to study it, but yeah, you'd be surprised at what people have dug into to try to disprove the Bible, only to come up that they were wrong. So Luke, in Luke 3:1, wrote, "Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip tetrarch of Ituraea, and the region of Trachonitis," I should have practiced those words ahead of time, and Lysanias the tetrarch of Abilene. Excuse me. He's writing about the time of John the Baptist. Okay, we could go further through chapter 3 and look at this, but what I've underlined here is where he writes about Lysanias, who's the tetrarch of Abilene. Tetrarch was a ruler of one of the areas. And so some historians have looked at this and have questioned Luke's entire account of the life of Jesus Christ on the basis of him putting Lysanias as the tetrarch of Abilene at the same time as these other men. Because we know from other historical records that Lysanias was a ruler of a place called Chalcis in the 30s BC. Now, the time of John the Baptist leading up to Jesus' ministry would be in the 30s AD, maybe the late 20s. So we've got a 50 to 60 year gap there where Lysanias was a ruler 50 to 60 years before the time of John the Baptist. How is this possible that Luke could be right? See, it looks at first glance like the historical evidence works against the Bible. However, Josephus, I've mentioned him in several of these talks. Josephus was the great Jewish historian working for the Romans, writing about the first century. Josephus made a possible reference when he wrote in the Wars of the Jews to a second leader named Lysanias, who would have come much later. And he wrote, he added to it the kingdom of Lysanias and that province Abilene, which Varus had governed. And what he's talking about is giving somebody some land, a a title and a piece of property that had belonged to Lysanias, who was the ruler of Abilene. And he writes about this. This would have fit Luke's time frame for a second person named Lysanias. But on top of that, within the last 100 years or so, I don't remember the exact date, you see this big rock here. Archaeologists have since discovered a temple inscription in Abila, which is what they referred to as Abilene. Sometimes names will have, places will have different names because you had the Greeks and the Romans and the Jews and Samaritans, and you had all of these people with their own languages inhabiting the same area. Places are going to have different names. So they found this temple inscription in Abila confirming the existence of a ruler named Lysanias during the time described by Luke. So it wasn't just some obscure reference by Josephus. Later on they found, hey, there's a second Lysanias here. Apparently it was a more common name than they realized. But Lysanias was found to be, in this temple inscription, the ruler of Abilene at the time described by Luke. Now it seems silly to me, excuse me, it seems a little silly to me that we would discount Luke's entire gospel just because they couldn't find evidence of this man Lysanias. Although, being someone who believes in the inerrancy of the Bible, that would present a problem for me if he had been wrong in that instance. But all it took was a little more time for archaeology to demonstrate he wasn't wrong at all, even in this little thing. And this inscription reads, "For the salvation of the August lords," and that doesn't mean the people in August. That means they were eminent, they were respectable. "For the salvation of the August lords and of all their household, Nymphaeus, freedman of Eagle, Lysanias tetrarch." Excuse me, there are a lot of words here that don't sound like they go, but that's what happens sometimes when things are translated. "Lysanias tetrarch established this street," and other things. So it's saying for these people, all these people listed ahead of time, Lysanias the tetrarch established this street and the other things. And so not only was he a ruler there, he was a ruler who was accomplishing things and getting things done and building things, and that's why we have this temple with his inscription on it. Excuse me. Then Luke also writes. Luke is attacked a lot, just like John. Seems like they tend to leave Matthew and Mark alone, or maybe I just haven't found where they've been attacked as much. But Luke and John are attacked a lot. Luke wrote, and I know this is in the book of Acts, and we're talking about the Gospels, but if Luke made mistakes in Acts, or if Luke got things wrong in Acts, it speaks to his credibility as a historian for the book of Luke anyway. He wrote in Acts 17:6, "And when they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, These that have turned the world upside down are come hither also." And you may remember this chapter from the many, many times I've preached on Acts 17, as they've gone into the city of Thessalonica, and there was a riot because they were preaching about the resurrection, and the people didn't want to hear it. And so it says that Jason and these others were brought to the rulers of the city. Well, that's the English translation. In the Greek, he uses the word politarch, which literally translated would be the rulers of the city. Poly comes from polis, meaning city. It's where we get the word politics, police, I think. And then arch, meaning ruler. That's why we have monarch. We have oligarch, meaning one ruler. Anyway, so this Greek word politarch is what's translated as ruler of the city. But some historians have questioned Luke's accuracy because he calls the rulers of Thessalonica by the Greek word politarch. Okay. Now, it sounds like a little thing, and probably it is, to discount somebody's entire account because they use the wrong word. For example, the leader of Germany, Angela Merkel, is called the Chancellor. But being the leader, suppose I, as an American, referred to her as the President. Well, Germany has another president, but she's the Chancellor. And suppose I was talking about the President of Germany. The President of Germany, just making sure y'all are awake this morning. The President of Germany, Miss Merkel. Well, it doesn't automatically discount everything that I'm saying about what's going on in Germany. It may call into question how well I understand German politics. It could just be a mistake, but it doesn't automatically mean I'm wrong about everything else. Again, this presents a problem, though, for us who believe in inerrancy if he's wrong, because they said the Romans they say the Roman government would not have referred to the rulers, to the leaders of the city of Thessalonica as the politarchs. The Romans would have had their own word that they would have used, presumably a Latin word, and politarch is a Greek word. And so they say Luke is not a good historian. He may not be wrong about everything, but he's not the credible historian you claim. Just like if I was referring to President Merkel, that would, I might not be wrong about everything, but it really calls into question my credibility. If we'll move forward here. But since then, archaeologists have discovered dozens, not just this one that I'm showing you that I believe is on display at the British Museum, but they've discovered dozens of inscriptions referring to politarchs from the Roman period. And that would have included in the area around Thessalonica in the time of the first century that Luke was writing about. Something even as simple as what people in a far-off city called their rulers, Luke got right, and historians had wrong all of this time. So Luke was just about as credible, I think, as you can get in a historian. You may be wondering what this picture is. This is a map of the north end of the Dead Sea area, and the big circle is around the modern city of Jericho. Excuse me. If we zoomed in on this satellite image a little more, you could see this dark area right here is where people are settled now. It's where the houses and buildings and roads and things are. And so that circle kind of sits on the big area of Jericho. And this circle I've drawn is not a small area either. But some people have questioned the credibility of the Gospels because when Jesus healed Bartimaeus of his blindness, Matthew and Mark both say that he was on his way out of Jericho. But Luke says he was entering Jericho at the time when he healed Bartimaeus. Now that sounds like a contradiction, and indeed it would be if there was one location of Jericho. But archaeology shows that there are at least 4 ancient sites of Jericho in close proximity. And Jericho is actually the oldest still inhabited city in the entire world. And what they've done is every time the city was destroyed by somebody, they would rebuild. And sometimes they would rebuild on the ruins of the old one. Sometimes they would rebuild, a quarter mile away. Sometimes they would rebuild partially on the ruins, but it would sit askew a little bit. And so Jericho just kind of was all over the place. And so within this circle area, you've got at least 4 ancient sites that were considered Jericho by the time of Christ in the first century. So it made it possible for Jesus to be walking out of one Jericho while simultaneously walking into another Jericho. So once again, what historians look at, and without knowing anything about the Bible, without knowing anything about the history of the area, you can look at that really easily and say, that's a contradiction. The Bible's full of lies. Archaeology demonstrates it's entirely possible for Jesus to do what we thought was impossible, to walk out of Jericho while walking into Jericho. Then we've got John, and I've mentioned this a couple times on Wednesday nights. People have attacked John's entire account because of his description of the pool of Bethesda. And he wrote in John 5:2, "Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches." And they said, this is absurd. This is crazy to believe that this 5-sided pool was there. We couldn't conceive of a 5-sided pool, what it would look like, why they would build something so strange. And they had never found evidence of it anywhere in Jerusalem. And so they said, this 5-sided pool, this pool with 5 porches, is just made up. I still struggle to understand why he would have made up that detail. If you're going to make stuff up, keep it simple. There's less to entrap you. But they said, this is crazy. And so on the basis of them thinking John was wrong about the design and the location of the pool of Bethesda where Jesus did one of his most public miracles, they said, well, the entire Gospel of John is suspect now. We can't believe a word John says. It's a pretty big leap. And so for a long time, John's account has been attacked because they had no record. They had no one in modern history had seen or recorded the pool of Bethesda. Now this changed in the late 19th century with the excavation of a unique 5-sided pool in Jerusalem. They found it. I'm a little bothered by the habit of the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox churches to have to worship everything, every artifact, and have to build churches on top of everything. If there's a possibility Jesus spent the night there on the way from one place to another, let's build a church there. And so they, in the Middle Ages or before, they covered up a lot of archaeology. And so where did they find the Pool of Bethesda? Well, they had built a church over it. That's why archaeologists couldn't find it. And in the late 19th century, they dug under this church and they found a unique five-sided pool. You can kind of see it a little bit there in the picture. That is the Pool of Bethesda. They discovered it in the 19th century, so sometime in the 1800s, and it took them 100 years to figure out that that's what it was. They're looking at it going, what is this thing? And it turns out what it was is a big rectangular pool that had a sort of dividing wall or a wall that came out in between two of the porches, which gave it, or two of the basins of it, which gave it a five-sided shape. And it was a Jewish ritual bath. And you can see the picture of it here. A lot of people owe John an apology as far as I'm concerned. But they found this pool. Now I could go into greater detail, but I'm just going to go quickly through a few of the other previously doubted archaeological discoveries from John's Gospel. Because even more so than Luke, I think people hold Luke to a high standard because of his reputation among Christians as a man of science, as a meticulous recorder. And he even says at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke that he set out to write an orderly account of the things that had happened. He was very careful in gathering his evidence. But John, even more than Luke, has been attacked and maligned, and I believe it's because what the other Gospels hint at, or what they talk about a little bit, which is the deity of Christ. Now, it's not just something John made up later. It's in all four Gospels, the deity of Christ. But what the others talk about, John shouts about. And I think for that reason, skeptics and theological liberals have been intent on destroying the credibility of the book of John to destroy the high Christology that he holds, the high view of Christ. And so there have been several archaeological things that have been doubted from the book of John, which we now know John was right all along. First of all, there's Jacob's well at Shechem. Now, this dates back to the Old Testament, but Jesus also met the woman at the well in one of the most interesting exchanges in the Gospels. And he talks to her about her 5 husbands, and the man she's with now is not her husband. And the woman ends up believing in Christ as a result of this example because she sees that he's not just a prophet, as she said, I perceive you're a prophet. She comes in everything I can tell to believe that he is the Son of God. Well, the best way to attack that story is to say, well, Jacob's well didn't really exist. Okay, it's just a fabrication. So if Jacob's well didn't exist, how did he meet the woman at the well? But here you see a picture of Jacob's well. Now, I'm sure when Jacob built it and when Jesus was there, it probably didn't have this big building around it. That again, hey, something from the Bible, let's build a church on it. But we see the well. We see where they drew water from. And the well is sitting there near Shechem, just like the Bible says it did. Then we've got the Pool of Siloam, another of the Jewish ritual baths where Jesus did a miracle, where Jesus healed somebody. Well, if the place isn't there, then the story's not true, and that's one other thing we can discount about Jesus being divine and being able to heal people. The problem is, archaeologists discovered this in 2004, meeting the description of the Pool of Siloam. And it's been there all along. The pavement where Pilate stood in judgment over Jesus Christ was doubted by historians because they said no such place existed. They said there is no Gabbatha, there is no pavement where it says, in the spot where it says, where he could have stood and held Jesus there before he pronounced his final judgment. Well, again, they were digging under a church, and they found evidence of these huge slabs of stone dating from the Roman period, right where the Bible says Jesus was held by Pilate before his crucifixion. And the stones are the Gabbatha, the pavement that the Bible talks about. And so yet again, in the last 100 years or so, archaeology has proven the skeptics and the secular historians to be wrong and that the Bible was right all along. We've got a couple more things that are doubted by skeptics, that there's some evidence that indicates the Bible was right when the skeptics have been wrong. Luke wrote, and it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, and all went to be taxed, every one into his own city. Who knows what this is talking about? What was about to happen? the birth of Christ. This was setting the stage for Mary and Joseph to have to go back to Bethlehem. If you can shoot that story full of holes, then you cast serious doubt on him being born at Bethlehem. There'd be no reason for it. It could easily be a story made up later. Then he's not the fulfillment of Micah's prophecy, and then everything just rolls downhill from there. So they've attacked Luke's account of this taxation or census, as we would use in our words today. They've attacked this account on really two bases. The first one is that they doubted this because they said there's no historical precedent for the Romans having a census like this. They just didn't do that. Well, that's not true, because Roman records that they've dug up record additional censuses. There's no archaeological evidence that I know of for this particular census, but they found other censuses that were completed in AD 48 and AD 104 that were similar. And this second one in AD 104, which was conducted by the Romans in Egypt, actually there's record that they required the subjects to return to where their family was from. They had to return to their city, of their ancestral city. So there is evidence that the Romans conducted censuses like this. And for those who've questioned, well, maybe he was wrong about it being all the world or all the Roman world. Maybe he was wrong about that detail. Maybe there was a census, maybe there was a taxation, but there's no record of an empire-wide census. John Ankerberg, who's, from what I can tell, a great apologist, says that when they would do these censuses, the records show that when they would do these, they would count the entire empire. But the Roman Empire being so massive, and travel, even with their incredible road system, travel taking so long, and it taking so long really to get anything accomplished, they would count a few provinces at a time until they'd covered the whole empire. So if you've got Judea being counted, but you have no record of them counting people in Italy at that time, in that same year, you can't discount an empire-wide census because maybe they got to Italy the next year or the year before. You know, it would take a while to count. It takes them almost a full year to count the U.S. Census, and we've got all this electronic stuff, and you can get in your car and drive out to the boondocks and count everybody who lives in trees. And folks, they couldn't do that. They couldn't do that 2,000 years ago. I'm assuming no one in here lives in trees. They didn't have even that ease 2,000 years ago. It would have been a big job to count the entire Roman Empire. They also doubt the account of Christ's birth and the taxation, the census, because they say the timeline is off. The timeline doesn't work. And you'll remember that verse says it was under the reign of Caesar Augustus, it was during the reign of Herod, and it was when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. Well, Herod the Great died in 4 BC, just about the time of the birth of Christ, or around the time of the birth of Christ. Cyrenius came to power 10 years later in AD 6. So there's a 10-year gap where Cyrenius couldn't have been governor of Syria until 10 years after the death of Herod. What a stupid mistake for Luke to have made. There was no overlap in their reigns for the census to take place. But again, just like with Lysanias, Cyrenius or Quirinius, depending on which language you're using, was more of a common name than the skeptics allow for. And a Roman coin, I could not find an actual photo of the coin, but here's a drawing of the photo of the coin. A Roman coin bearing his inscription indicates that another earlier Cyrenius was the proconsul of Syria from about 11 BC until after Herod's death. So if he became proconsul of Syria in 11 BC and Herod died in 4 BC, there was a 7-year overlap in their reigns when the census could have taken place and Jesus could have been born. And most historians now believe Jesus was born in about 6 BC rather than at 1 AD or whatever they hold, whatever the traditional view is. So it's not necessarily out of, there's nothing historically that prevents the census from taking place the way Luke said. And then some skeptics have also questioned the reliability of the Gospels based on their belief that Nazareth didn't exist in the 1st century AD. Have you ever heard that? Reading through this book and putting this study together was the first time I'd ever heard that people say Nazareth didn't exist. Okay, but that does create a lot of problems because Jesus is said to be from Nazareth. That would undermine seriously the credibility of the Gospels as truthful accounts of Jesus Christ, who he was and what he did, if they couldn't even get his birthplace right. If Nazareth didn't exist in the 1st century AD, we have serious problems. And the reason they think this or thought this is because for many years the earliest written record of Nazareth outside of the New Testament was from the 4th century AD. So we're looking at about 350 years after Jesus' time, we find the first written records of Nazareth. There was no written record of it before this that they knew of. And so they said, well, Nazareth couldn't have existed. Surely there would have been written record of it. But there was. One ancient document that they discovered detailed the reassignments of the temple priests after Jerusalem was sacked by the Romans in AD 70. They destroyed the temple. They destroyed much of the city. The priests were kind of out of work if there's no temple. And so what they did was they reassigned them, spread them throughout the countryside to go and minister to the people where they were. And this document indicates that one of the priests was sent to, at least one of the priests was sent to this supposedly non-existent town. So either Nazareth existed in the 1st century or he was sent to preach to livestock in a field somewhere. On top of that, it's more than just a written record, but excavations of the local cemetery in Nazareth show that there were people living there. Okay, for them to die there and be buried there, they were living there during the time of Christ. And at the time of his birth, at the time of his childhood, it would have been a small village of about 500 people. Okay, really just a wide spot in the road. Can you imagine why there wouldn't be written record of that town? We've driven through some tiny places that are just wide spots in the road. A couple weeks ago when we were heading back to go to the doctor, we drove through this town, and I told Christian, I thought I knew where everything was, every town was in Oklahoma. I thought I had heard of every weirdly named town until we drove through this little town called Arpalar. I said, I don't even know where we are. And I got on Google trying to see what I could find about Arpalar. There was very little written record of Arpalar because it's just a wide spot in the road. Well, Nazareth at the time would have even less of a written record because that's before Google. Tiny little wide spot in the road. I can't imagine why they would expect people in the seat of power at Jerusalem to be writing books and books about Nazareth. And that would also explain why one of the disciples said when he was introduced to Jesus, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" That was not a slam at Nazareth because they had a bad reputation. They were the wrong side of the tracks. Really, you would expect the King of Kings to be born in some place more prestigious, in some place better. Like there was a church, a denomination that was headquartered. It said World Headquarters on its sign, not far from the house where I grew up in Moore. And I thought, what kind of church would have its world headquarters in Moore, Oklahoma? It's the same sort of thing. Can anything good come out of Moore? Can anything big come out of Moore? Other than Toby Keith? Well, can anything good really come out of Nazareth? That would explain why they would ask that question. And John McRae, who is, I can't remember which university he's from, but he said that archaeology has not produced anything that is unequivocally a contradiction to the Bible. So they've not, contrary to what people claim today, there's not all this evidence that the Bible's a lie. They've not found anything that disproves the Bible. And on the contrary, as we've seen, there have been many opinions of skeptical scholars that have been codified into fact over the years, but that archaeology has shown to be wrong. So in contrast, all the time, historians and scientists are writing things and coming out with theories, and the world just says, oh, that's fact, that's accepted fact. And archaeology proves them to be wrong time and time again. I know I use this example a lot, but what about the Hittites? And historians said for centuries the Bible was full of lies because the Hittites never existed. There's no record. The Hittites did not exist. That was accepted as fact until some archaeologists in the 1880s discovered a city, nearly underground city, I think, that they had never heard of before, they'd never seen before, and a civilization they'd never seen before. And as they dug and discovered more, they found out all these scholars were wrong all this time in their fact that the Hittites didn't exist, because this city in the middle of Turkey was what the Bible had been talking about. So archaeology has done nothing to disprove the Bible, and everything we know about archaeology has corroborated the historical and scientific claims of the Bible. And it made me think of this verse, and I realize it's in a different context that Jesus is speaking. But he was talking to the Pharisees, and it says, "He answered and said unto them, I tell you that if these should hold their peace, the stones would immediately cry out." And the Pharisees were giving Jesus trouble because the disciples were just a little too boisterous in their praise of him. And he said, "Why can't you quiet down your followers?" essentially is what they asked. And Jesus responds to them, "If these kept quiet, if these men didn't praise me, the stones would." And it made me think, even though he's speaking in a different context, even if men are not willing to admit the truth of God's Word, even if men are not willing to admit the accuracy of this book on which we've placed our faith, folks, the stones cry out. Every time they excavate, the stones cry out that what they say about him is true.